Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
All right, Dave, you said last time this is your favorite time of year. I thought you were like alluding to a late Christmas or something, but it's March Madness, right?
It is March Madness. We got through our first weekend.
Yeah. Are you rooting for a particular team?
I think we talked a little bit about this last time. I am all in on Duke this year.
Duke, that's right.
I've always been a Duke fan, not diehard. I have some family who went there.
Yeah.
But I think Mike Krzyzewski, Coach K, is just one of the best ever. It's his last year. He's retiring.
Right.
42 years coaching at Duke. 42 years
That's
at
an
the
amazing
same school.
stretch. Yeah.
And 15 conference championships, I think, and all of these wins. It would be really cool to see him win on his way out.
Right.
It is a little interesting. We talked about incentives last week and how incentives really change the game for people. And I wanted to talk about that, but one thing we didn't talk about is how those incentives are affecting his team, right? I mean, he's got a lot of guys on that team who are thinking about going pro.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to work on their draft stock and their draft status and all of that kind of stuff. And at the same time, you can tell on every single one of those players, winning a championship for him on the way out is their number one incentive right now. Yeah. And at times you see the extra pressure.
Number two incentive.
What's number one?
Well, they're working on forming new chapters of the Vino Veritas Society.
If only. If only. You can just see that motivation working for them. But at the same time, it's interesting how that incentive, that motivation changes things, and sometimes they press a little too hard. There's a little too much adrenaline. The shots aren't going down because you can see just that pressure of they're putting on themselves to do this, how it's affecting them. And it was an interesting observation. Now, I did go back, and when I watched the games over the weekend, and I watched a lot of basketball over the weekend, but when I was watching the games, I thought a lot about our conversation last week, and I thought about this idea of incentives matter, and I thought about this idea of how is it going to affect each individual player based on where their future is going. Are they young? Are they seniors? Are they going pro? Are they not going pro? And how will those different incentives with name, image, and likeness being a thing go in? And it's interesting because it goes back to the question of prudence that we've talked about for so long.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's really hard to tell. And I think we live in a world today where we like to think, okay, I can know what somebody's incentives are, and I can probably pretty easily understand. And
it's not always clear.
And it's really unclear. And there's a lot of guys who you think, okay, this guy over here, he's the star player on a bad team, and he's just going to want to show up and be this great ball player because he wants that name, image, and likeness deal next year. He wants to improve his draft stock for the draft or whatever it might be. But then you see them win a game as an underdog. You see them come back and have this like great game, and you see them make that last pass at the end of the game as opposed to taking the shot. And you're like, that incentive, sometimes you think about the incentives, but sometimes instinct just kicks in.
Sure.
And you make that pass because it's right there. Great example is your friend's son, Christian Brown.
Yeah.
The guy had a great weekend. He really is a spectacular player. And it'll be really interesting to follow him this offseason. I wonder what those incentives are for him because he's debating this. Do I go pro out as a junior?
Yeah.
Or am I going to come back and play my senior year at Kansas and really be the superstar on the team?
Well, and I want to extrapolate from what you just said and blow it up into a much bigger subject than just sports or just basketball. When we talk about markets, if you go open up a business, any business, you're in some kind of a market. There's going to be other people trying to do something similar to what you're trying to do. And anyone who's in the business world knows you have to study the choices people make and why.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the business mind. You want to know, what are people choosing and why are they choosing? Are they choosing things because it's the best? Are they choosing it because it's the cheapest, right? Are they choosing it because it's the most convenient? What is it that's driving, that's incentivizing their choices? And that whole realm, that's the realm of freedom.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons progressives loathe markets. They will talk about it. You don't have to look far to find progressive commentators and thinkers and scholars describing things like the chaos of free market economics, right? I mean, it's just like the wild, wild west. They hate that fact that people are making different choices, and you actually have to go study. If you want to be competitive, you have to go study what choices are they making and why, and then try to figure out how are you going to compete? How are you going to open up a business and try to tap into those choices? The progressive view is, well, people just shouldn't be making so many choices on their own, right? We should just have experts making those choices for them. I want to encourage our members to think about this. Every time you think of the subject regulations, every time you read a news story that involves some kind of regulation, it doesn't even matter what it is. A regulation, by definition, is a choice that was taken away from a citizen and given to a bureaucrat. That's what a regulation is. Behind everyone is this idea that really an expert should make this choice, not you, Dave. You're just an ordinary citizen, right? Or other people. You shouldn't be making these choices, and therefore we don't have to study all the incentives as to why people. We'll have Anthony Fauci make those choices for you.
Well, what's so interesting about that is how you start to define who's the expert, and in a government bureaucratic regulatory standpoint, it's whoever the government puts in the bureaucracy. They're defined as the expert. Even if you as an individual citizen know more than that so-called expert. And it's funny because you make that comparison to the NCAA tournament and to sports. Yeah. Because I would use sports again as the perfect analogy for that. And we just heard the news a couple of weeks ago about Tom Brady coming back to football. and there's something interesting about it. Tom Brady, when he left the Patriots, talked a lot about how when you played for the Patriots, you didn't get a choice. You did whatever Bill Belichick and Josh McDaniels, the head coach, the offensive coordinator, whatever they told you to do, you went out and did. There was no ad-libbing. There was no anything else. Right. Here's the play. Go out and execute the play that we tell you to do. It's become known over the years as the Patriot way. They have a very specific, this is how we practice, this is how we play, this is what you're supposed to do, and you do not deviate from what the coaches tell you. Because why? The coaches are the expert. Yeah. But Tom Brady is arguably, and I'm going to say this, and a lot of people are going to call me blasphemous. Tom Brady is arguably the greatest quarterback of all time, and if not, he's easily in the top 3 or 5. Yeah. So is he an expert? When he was in New England, no. They said, you're not an expert. I'm the coach. I'm being paid to coach, and I'm going to tell you exactly what to do. He then goes to Tampa Bay, plays under Bruce Arians, who I would argue is one of the best offensive coaches. He's a head coach, but one of the best offensive coaches in NFL history. Yeah. And he still said to Tom Brady, go do whatever you want. Right. You're the expert. You go out on the field. I'm going to recommend a play. Yeah. And when you get to the line of scrimmage, you're the expert. If you're out there and you see change the play. I don't care. It's your offense. You do what you want. Right. And it's amazing how you talk about free market. Brady got to make a choice. Right. When he left the Patriots, do I want to stay with the Patriots where I have to listen to an expert and no, I don't get to do anything. I don't get to be considered the expert. Or do I want to go to Tampa where he goes and he wins a Super Bowl in his first year?
That's a great point. Yeah.
Because they said, you're an expert. You go do whatever you want to do. Right. And he's talked about, now that he's coming back, he announced his retirement, decided to come back. He's done several interviews where he said it was so much more fun playing in Tampa Bay, where he had the respect as the expert and the freedom to play the way he wanted to play.
Make those choices.
And make those choices was more fun, was more enjoyable, and he was more successful. At 40 plus years old, he's having the best seasons of his career because he's finally getting to show that he is the expert.
And you keep in mind, from a kind of an entrepreneurial perspective, that also means he was accepting more responsibility.
Absolutely.
Back in New England, if a play turned out to be foolish, a foolish choice of a play, Brady could always say, hey, look, I was running the plays, that the coaches said I had to. But here he's taking on, there's a lot more. I mean, and this is true in every aspect of life. When you have a greater realm of choices available, on the one hand, that's more freedom. You get to make more choices, but that's also more risk. That's more responsibility, because if you choose foolishly and the results are bad, it's the consequences are coming down on you.
It's a great point. It's just so interesting how that analogy, I mean, it's just so perfect. And we see this in all sports, right? As you're watching the NCAA tournament, the same way, I think about the coaches who call that timeout when you got one last shot,
right?
And there's 10 seconds left. It's a tie game. You've got one shot. You have the coaches who call timeout, who say, I'm going to drop the play. You're going to do exactly what I tell you to do.
Yes.
And then you have the coaches who say, I've got the better team on the floor. And I've got a master at point guard who knows what he's doing.
Just get him the ball.
Just get him the. I'm just going to let my team. I'm going to tell them in the previous timeout, if it comes down to the last shot, get him the ball. He'll be in charge. And they don't call timeout. Doesn't let the defense prepare. And a lot of times they're more successful. And so it shows what freedom can accomplish.
It raises this whole question, which is connected to all these subjects we're talking about. What does it really mean to coach? What is a coach? Is a coach a kind of central planner? Is that what a coach is? Or is a coach out there someone who encourages his players to practice and coordinate and then watches them, thrive at what they do best? And what lessons can we take from that when we start to look at the realm of government, of regulations, right, which is filled with central planning? I mean, I always ask people to imagine, you had mentioned earlier that those regulators very often, they're not the smartest person. They're really not the experts. And it's true, right? If you know how to make the next generation of smartphone, whatever that is going to be, I don't know. I don't know what it's going to be. Otherwise, I'd be making it. If you know what that is, you don't go work as a bureaucrat for the FCC and make $120,000 salary. No. You go invent the next generation, right? You become the next Steve Jobs, the next Bill Gates. That's what you do. The regulators are always 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 steps behind the innovators and the entrepreneurs, but by definition. I always think of that famous scene in where was it? The Wright brothers flew their airplane. Kitty Hawk. Imagine you're down there in Kitty Hawk. It was kind of a foggy, cold morning, right? And these guys are about to try something that had never been done in all of history. No one had attached a heavy metal, right, internal combustion engine to a frame with some wings and made it fly. And no one knows if it's going to work, right? It's this tremendous event. And by golly, the thing takes off. And there it goes. And it's sail, right? It is flying. And imagine in that moment, the Wright brothers just did what no human beings ever anywhere had done. Imagine a regulator standing there, and he's got his clipboard and he's got his pencil, and he says, now I'm going to tell you how to fly it and how to build it, right? The regulator doesn't. The guys who know most about this are the guys who are figuring it out and actually building it.
Well, and there's an important point there about incentives also, right? As we continue this conversation about incentives, a regulator is incentivized to control entrepreneurship and innovation because they don't want it to get too far ahead of them, because then they lose their control. So they have incentives about putting regulations in place to make sure an inventor, an innovator can't get too far out ahead of them, so they're not falling too far behind and having to play more catch up. I mean, we literally have a system that is incentivized to stop innovation and entrepreneurship.
To stifle it, to slow it down. And if technology ever does get too advanced beyond what the regulators know, the regulators call in the innovators, the inventors, right? And say, please explain this new technology to us, because we want to be able to regulate it. And if you step back and just think for a moment how ridiculous that is. Why are the lesser intelligent ones regulating and controlling the more intelligent ones? Why are those with less creativity, with less inventiveness in their minds, controlling and regulating the more creative, the more inventive?
It's also interesting, and we talk about incentives, what you end up finding is the only people who can be really innovative within a regulatory environment are the ones who are controlling the regulators, are influencing the regulators through lobbying and through financial means. So if you really want to be that great innovator, often it doesn't happen third party. Often you're not some outside company trying to build something. Instead, you're the entrepreneur inside of Google or inside of Microsoft who says, hey, there's something we can do here. Or you go to them and you say, hey, I have an idea, but I know the regulators are going to stop me. I'll come work for you.
Yep.
And think about how much money and how much opportunity it costs that entrepreneur, that innovator to say, I'm going to have to go give this to a bigger company because they can go lobby the regulator to allow me to do it. And it's really a disappointing, sad commentary on where we've gotten.
So who would have thought, right? From the subject of March Madness, college basketball, sports in general, it turns out there's a lot of life lessons to be gleaned from those subjects, including political subjects, how to think about regulations, how to think about government, how to think about incentives, and how that changes choices that people make.
Well, so as we talk about that, I wanted to get into today a little bit about understanding life choices, understanding incentives, and we've kind of veered away over the last couple of weeks away from what's happening in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. I'd like to get there. So before we move into talking about Ukraine and Russia and some of the lessons and some of the life lessons that we can talk about there, I thought I really wanted to talk a little bit about us as a community. We have had a couple of members who have lost loved ones very close in their life in the last few days. One a grandfather, one a father. This is a community, and while we're here to learn, while we're here to become better, to practice and become better at talking about these ideas and everything else, we always say if you're going to line up next to somebody, stand next to somebody, pledge your life, your fortune, your sacred honor, if it ever comes down to that, you need to know them, you need to trust them.
You got to care about them.
And you got to care about them. And we have two people who have been with us from the very beginning, who have been amazing advocates for the Vino and Veritas Society. And I would feel wrong if we didn't, I don't want to use names. I don't want to put anybody in an uncomfortable situation.
Just know we're thinking about you.
Just know we're thinking about you, and so is the rest of the community, and it's important.
And I think that's a huge thing moving forward. Free people. I was on a radio show earlier today, and I was talking about this. Free people are independent people. They tend to be self-reliant. They're not dependent on the government. They're not going and turning to government. They're independent and self-reliant to a large degree, and yet bad things happen. They do. It's just a fact of life that we'll never eliminate. Some bad things happen, and when life throws you a curveball, when something bad goes on, sickness, accidents, all kinds of painful experiences, it really matters to have a circle of friends, family, people you know, trust, people who care about you that you can turn to for help. Because the truth is, all of us need help at some time or another. And the more help we provide for each other, the more that we actually care about each other, the less we need to turn to government.
Right.
The more we turn to government, the less we tend to turn to friends, family, fellow citizens. And that's really at the heart of what we're doing with the Vino and Veritas Society. We want a large, robust community of friends, of patriots who know each other, trust each other, care about each other, and actually help when that's needed.
Right. Well, for those two members, those two guardians, I hope they will turn to their chapters, turn to other members of the Vino and Veritas Society. Everybody, I've talked to a few people. I know everybody would step up and do whatever they need, and we're all here for each other, and that's what this is all about. And there's going to come a time, hopefully not in the too distant future, where it's not just a few people in their chapter here, but there'll be people across the country.
That's right.
Who, you need something, I'm here.
Yep.
And we can help each other out, and that's what makes America so special. So with that in mind, I think just wanted to talk about that a little bit before we move on to the bigger topic. And the bigger topic I'd like to discuss today is the lessons that Americans need to take away from what we're observing in Ukraine and Russia. And I'm going to...
Maybe we should say the lessons they should take away.
They should take away.
Whether they will or not is a different thing. But we're here to nudge them in the right direction, right?
So let me just set the stage for what I'm talking about. And I think you can kind of run with it a little bit from there. But what we're seeing in Ukraine and Russia, and there's been a lot of news coming out, and I think all of us are in this sort of position right now where we're not sure what news is real, what news is fake, what news is what can we hear that's legitimate.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of stories swirling about Zelensky's past and the Ukrainian government's past.
Yeah.
I don't know really where everything falls, but what I do know about government in general is no government is free of corruption.
You know, I certainly agree with you. And these two governments, the Russian government and the Ukraine government, are probably farther down the spectrum of corruption than many. But also to your point of, people don't know, they don't know what's true, what's accurate in the news. Many people, I think, don't even know for sure who to be rooting for. And part of it is this very simplistic, well, I like to refer to as a kind of childlike way of looking at the world. When you're around little children and say you're watching a movie or reading a story, small children very often want to know who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. They'll ask that question, Daddy, who is he the good guy or is he the bad guy? They want it to be just very clear. This is the good guy. This is the hero. This is the bad guy. He's very bad. He's always bad. And of course, real human beings are nothing like that. They're far more complicated. The bad guys aren't all bad, or they're not always doing something bad. The good guys aren't always good. The truth is, what you usually witness are human beings who fail to rise up to the levels of excellence in all kinds of areas of their life, and yet occasionally will do something noble.
Right.
Something magnanimous. There will be a moment where someone makes a choice that is a beautiful, glorious choice, and they deserve celebration for that. That doesn't mean that person is an angel. It doesn't mean that person is perfect. It means in that moment, that person chose the right thing.
It's an interesting conversation. I'm going to take us on a little tangent on that point and bring us back to this, and I'll circle back to this. The Netflix special series Cobra Kai. You watched any of this? Are you aware of Cobra Kai?
I'm aware of it. I was a Karate Kid fan. The first one came out when I was in high school.
Right.
so
you were
very much aware.
Daniel's age.
Yeah. But I have not watched this new Cobra Kai series.
So Ralph Macchio, who plays Daniel in The Karate Kid, LaRusso, he's actually one of the writers of this and producers of this spin-off of it. And it's actually based off of, I don't know if he came up with it or if he actually watched the show. There was a long running joke in the sitcom How I Met Your Mother. That if you really think about the Karate Kid movies, our hero and villain, our protagonist and antagonist were actually reversed.
Yeah.
They would make the argument that Johnny, the bad guy, was actually the one who Daniel came in, stole his girlfriend, was picking on him. He was the king of the school. And all of a sudden, Daniel came in and started picking fights and tried to take his spot on the soccer team and stole his girlfriend and all of these things. And that Johnny was actually the victim. So Cobra Kai as a show, the whole concept is he wrote this as this isn't clear. And he rewrote, he tells the story of Johnny wasn't all good or all bad. Right. There were some things that were bad about him. Right. But he was also talking about his abuse by his father leaving him, and the things he was missing out on as a kid, and some of the things that Daniel did wrong. And it really brings these two characters together and shows the gray in between the black and white of the protagonist and the antagonist. Yeah. And I think about that exactly in the way you're talking about, right? You have Zelensky and you have Putin. Mm-hmm. I have a hard time saying that there's really anything good about Vladimir Putin. Right. But to call Zelensky all good or all bad is really a hard thing to do. We don't know.
I will make just one point about Putin, and that is he's been fairly consistent over a long stretch of time. He has told many people, he's told the world, here's what I am going to do. Yeah. If you do this, here is how I'm going to respond. And it's not like nobody had any idea about this. He's been telling people for a long time, this is what I'm going to do. So in that sense, right, there's some virtue.
So if honesty is a virtue.
Yeah. If honesty is a virtue, he's been honest. He's been fairly clear about that.
Sure. So we've heard a lot of people battling over, is the Ukrainian government, are they corrupt? Are they clean? Is Zelensky corrupt or is he clean?
Right.
All of these questions. And now you start adding in Hunter Biden and Burisma, and Joe Biden influencing and bribing and essentially holding hostage Ukraine's government to sit there and say, hey, if you don't fire this prosecutor, you're out of here. And what role did all of these people play? And a lot of the people who are starting to come out saying Ukraine government is corrupt are a lot of people who are big supporters of Donald Trump. And I'm listening yesterday to an interview. I was watching the highlight of an interview that Donald Trump gave to Fox Business yesterday, where he said, I fully support Zelensky. He says, this is a guy who, when the Democrats tried to impeach me over me being Trump, impeach me over this phone call, Zelensky was the first one to come out and say, he said nothing wrong on this call. He didn't pressure me. He didn't do anything that would make me uncomfortable. So he's sitting there backing Zelensky. And I think it all of a sudden left all of these people, I don't know what to think anymore. At the core of this whole confusion is the reality that there's really only two groups of people who are really getting hurt and there's nothing good for them there. And that's the people of Ukraine. And that's the people of Russia. You sit there and you watch these two groups of people who have these two governments who are battling, who are fighting, who are making decisions that affect their lives to the point of potential death. And they're almost just sitting there stuck.
Including up to potential world war. Right. Not just war between those two countries. God forbid this thing escalates. But it raises this big question of what is the relationship between a people and their government? Are they synonymous? Are they the same? Are they fundamentally different? One of the things I like to point out, we certainly see this here in the United States. We see it in every nation. We see it wherever there are governments. There will always be citizens or subjects, depending on the regime, who will disassociate themselves from their government. They'll say, those are the people, those are the elites over there in the government, and I have nothing in common with me. They don't represent me. I don't even like them, right? And if they go get into a war, that's their war. That's not my war. And I certainly understand that sentiment. I experience it myself quite frequently. But I want to remind people, including fellow United States citizens, fellow members of the Vino and Veritas Society, you might not associate yourself with your government. You might think there's a big gulf, a big division, that you're totally different, totally separate. But you know who does associate you together? The rest of the world.
Yes.
The rest of the world does. And so when the Russian government does something unjust, does something belligerent, it attacks another nation wrongly, the rest of the world is going to punish. Who are they going to punish? They're going to punish Russia. And Russia is not merely the Russian government. That includes the Russian people. So a lot of the sanctions, a lot of the retribution, a lot of the punishment is felt the most by the people of Russia. And so this is a powerful, back to the subject of incentives. This is a really important incentive. This is a powerful incentive for all people everywhere to take some ownership, take some responsibility for your own government. Because if your own government goes and does bad things, you know who's going to be the first to suffer? You are.
Right.
You, the people, are going to be the first to suffer. Those in government, even if things get really bad, take Russia, for example. If sanctions and or military power against Russia, if it gets really bad, I promise you, those who are in the Russian government will be the last to suffer.
Right.
If things like supplies of food and water really run short, those in government will be the last ones to run out of the food. The first ones to run out of food would be the ordinary people.
Well, look at North Korea for the perfect example of that.
Yes.
You have Kim Jong-un, who's heavy, who clearly has enough to eat and is eating nice meals and everything else. And there are people in North Korea who are eating grass to survive.
Yeah.
I mean, literally eating the grass on their yard just to get something in their stomach.
It reminds me a name that might be familiar to our members, Anthony Davies. He's a friend of the Vino and Veritas Society, friend of ours. He's an economist at Duquesne University, and he has done some interesting research and put together some fascinating graphs demonstrating. He's tackled this whole idea of income inequality, and he sort of went into it assuming that income inequality was greatest where there are great amounts of income. So the freer nations would have higher levels of inequality, that kind of measurable economic inequality. And what he discovered was the opposite.
Right.
Turns out when you control for levels of economic and individual liberty, the most despotic regimes, the most tyrannical regimes where there is very little liberty, where there's virtually no economic freedom at all, they have gross, enormous levels of inequality because you have huge populations of people who are eating grass, who are eating bugs, who have nothing. And then you have this elite few who are in the government, of course, and they're living in gold-plated palaces, right? And they have private chefs, right, preparing food for them. When you move to the other side of the spectrum and you start examining sort of modern developed nations that have higher degrees of individual liberty and economic freedom, that income inequality shrinks. And it turns out even the poorest people, and you look at the United States as an example, even the poorest Americans tend to have big flat screen TVs, they have smartphones, they have brand new shoes. If they get sick, they are a stone's throw away from world-class medical care. Mm-hmm. They have access to all these things that poor people in the rest of the world don't have. And so that those levels of inequality actually shrink.
There's another important aspect of, you talk about economic freedom and liberty.
Mm-hmm.
The key in all of that is protection of private property, right? When you have protection of private property, you have this ability to lift yourself up. You have this ability to use your skills, your labor, your resources to find ways to lift yourself up. In these despotic regimes, you don't have that protection of private property. And when the elites start to run out of food, start to run out of resources, they don't go and make their own. They just come and steal what's out there in the community.
Right. Or point guns at people and say, go grow more, go plant and grow more. And when you take these kind of economic surveys and studies, and then you expand them over time, the story really gets interesting, because where you have very little individual liberty and very little economic freedom, where you have very little protection for property rights, the class of the poor number one, they tend to be very poor, like barely surviving poor, and the poor stay poor over generations. The children of poor people are poor,
right?
And their children are poor. There is no escape, because they can't create value. They can't create wealth for themselves by producing value for others, because they can't keep their property isn't secure. Where property rights are secure, relatively speaking, and where the laws respect and protect individual liberty, economic freedom, what you find is, number one, you find some poor people working their way out of poverty. They do create wealth for themselves by producing value for others. And then when you look at it over time, you find that the children of poor people very often are not poor. They're middle class or upper middle class, and then the grandchildren, and you keep going, and you see this very fluid system where the descendants of poor people are sometimes very comfortably wealthy, and the opposite.
Yeah,
the descendants of wealthy people often become poor because they're foolish, right, with what they do with their money and the things that they inherit, and they'll lose a lot of money.
There's an interesting way to look at this, and I want to get into it, but I want you to preface it. You posted something on Facebook this week that I thought was really interesting, and it was about what is a civilized culture.
Yeah.
Right. You compared barbaric versus civilized, and you offered a definition. And I want to play off of that a little bit. So if you would, maybe give that background a little bit first to anybody who didn't see it online.
Yeah, I was asking this question: what does it mean to be civilized? What is a civilization? And many people will contrast that idea of being civilized with being barbaric or being savage as the opposite. And I pointed out all these terms, they really beg some definitions. In the case of barbaric, or a barbarian, of course, there was a famous novel series, and then this was one of Arnold Schwarzenegger's breakout roles, was as Conan the Barbarian, where he didn't have many speaking lines in there. But the word barbarian comes from, there's a Greek origin of it, and in the Greek, it was literally, I can't think of the name of the label for words that sound like the sound you're trying to describe. I can't think of it. It's okay. I'll think of it later. The barbarians would go bar, 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 bar. That was the Greek way of almost mocking people who didn't speak Greek. Mm-hmm. To them, it just all sound like barbarine gibberish. Yep. And they called them barbarians. Barbarian, by definition, simply meant non-Greek.
Right.
It didn't really mean, it wasn't a statement about, are they nice people? Are they rude people? Are they peaceful? Are they violent? It just meant they're not Greek. They don't speak Greek. So there's really no moral judgment in that the origin of the word barbaric. Same with the word savage. Ever since the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau made the argument that he invents that concept of the noble savage, that to be savage, to be uncivilized, to be highly irrational, to not cultivate your reason, your language, your understanding of science. Rousseau praised that. Right. And he said that is a more authentic, more natural kind of human being. The noble savage lives a more natural life than people who live in a state of society, civilized society. So all these things require some definition. And I proposed a definition for thinking about what it means to be civilized. It means that, number one, we understand that the foundation for each of us, the foundation of our own rights, our own liberty, is the same foundation for the rights and liberty of other people as well. To recognize that, and then working to protect the liberty, the rights of the most vulnerable. Because the most powerful, they're usually pretty good at protecting themselves. By definition, they're the most powerful. What about the weakest among us, the most vulnerable? A civilized people will care for the most vulnerable, whereas a savage people, an uncivilized people, will prey upon them. Curiously, Thomas Jefferson, he addresses this in the one book he wrote, which was titled "The Notes on the State of Virginia."
Right.
And he's discussing this idea of civilization. And so Jefferson, right? Thomas Jefferson, slave owner Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, very, very imperfect man himself, not purely heroic, right? Not pure villain, some mixture of the two. He used various native tribes to illustrate this point and how they treat women.
Okay.
There were some tribes that really held, because by nature, now I'm going to say something really radical here, Dave. By nature, males, natural biological males tend, if you survey many of them, as groups, they tend to be stronger and faster than biological human females.
Careful.
Yeah, I know. We're really, on the edge of things here, which is, not least of which it's highly problematic when you have men's sports and women's sports and we start mixing these things up. But Jefferson's point was to show how the more civilized tribes were the ones that protected the rights of the women among them. And then there were the really uncivilized tribes, they treated the women among them, their own women, as breeders when they were young. They were sexual objects for the men. Then when they became older and less attractive, they would use the women basically as beasts of burden, like mules. It was the women who would move carry everything on their backs and move the camps. And then when they got too old to do that, too feeble, they just desert them.
Right.
Just leave them to freeze or get eaten by wolves or whatever terrible fate happened. And Jefferson's point, this very imperfect man, Jefferson, said, that's an uncivilized people who they don't protect the most vulnerable, the weakest. They just set them out to die. And so that was the point that I was making in that post.
Well, and to that point, it goes back to the virtues of the Vino Veritas Society. That this idea of knowing when to be self-restrained and when to know to be self-assertive, and know how to be self-reliant, and how that all works together when you help people, when you help yourself, when you need to make good decisions. I bring this up because at no point in that definition, and I think this was really important, at no point in that definition did you talk about government. You talked about how people interact with each other. Yeah. Right. And I look at what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, and I think about what about other cultures, other countries, other societies around the world, and how they're interacting with the people of Russia, of Belarus, of Ukraine.
Right.
And are we, as other countries that don't have government control, are we acting in a civilized, rational manner with them? And the reason I bring this up is we use a platform, some people know, and we use a platform to manage a lot of contract workers.
Right.
Vino Veritas Society is still growing.
Yep.
We're still trying to do things. We don't have full-time staff.
Right.
So a lot of this is just you and I, and then bringing in contractors to help when we need it. But
I will say we have some really talented, incredible contractors.
We really do. We really do. And some of them are here, and some of them are overseas.
Right.
Unfortunately, because of a lot of the rules and regulations and expectations of what happens when you hire somebody in the United States, or what it costs to operate in the United States because of regulators and bureaucrats, it's out of our price range to be able to do some of that work here.
That's a huge point that's worth repeating, given we were just talking about regulations and the incentives and disincentives they create, including the costs. What regulations drive the price of everything up. It doesn't make anything less expensive or less efficient. I'm sorry, more efficient. It makes it less efficient, more expensive. And so it's kind of, I want to say, on the one hand, we have met some wonderful contractors. Honestly, we couldn't make this happen without their talent, their art, their creativity. I mean, we've met some really good, talented people. And at the same time, I will say it is shameful to me. It's embarrassing that we cannot hire fellow Americans to do more work because it's so expensive. The regulatory burdens drive the cost of labor up so high here in the United States. That's why we look to these platforms of people working in other countries.
Well, and it goes beyond that. It's not just the cost of labor, but it's the cost of living. That they have to charge so much more, and the cost of living is so much higher because of all of the other regulations. I mean, these regulations play on top of each other. It's one on top of the other on top of the other that causes everything to get more expensive.
Issue some regulations that say no more building of houses in this community because there's some gophers out there in the field. And we don't want to disturb the gophers, right? So don't build any more houses. You limit the supply of houses. Guess what happens to the price of housing? Now all of a sudden, housing prices go up and up and up and up. It's more expensive. And so those people trying to live in those houses have to earn more money, so they have to charge more for their services.
You've been listening to city council meetings in Boulder. For anybody who doesn't know this has been like a 10-year ongoing battle in city council is groundhogs and gophers.
Literally gophers.
Living in certain areas of Boulder that there are groups preventing development in the city of Boulder because of they're worried about groundhogs and gophers. I digress. The reason I bring this up and the reason I wanted to talk about it was we have some of these contractors because of these costs that are that are overseas, two of which are in Ukraine.
Right.
One of which I've been working with for years.
Yep.
And he's actually the one who did our logo.
Yep.
He's done a lot of our design work.
Yep.
And he is incredible.
Talented, really talented, good guy.
And I've reached out to him a few times since everything has started, and just to check in on him, just to see how he's doing, how his family's doing. And
he's in Ukraine.
He is in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And the worst part about it is he says, I'm here, but I'm fighting on occasion.
Right.
I'm protecting my family as often as I can. I'm working to get my family out of the country. We're in and out of bomb shelters all the time. He says, I can't work. I don't have the opportunity to go be productive.
Yep.
So all of this is hurting somebody like him.
Yes.
Because there's this war going on that he doesn't want. He didn't want the Russians invading Ukraine.
Between two governments.
Yeah. That he just wanted to do his work and everything else.
Yeah.
And further, the platform that we use to work with him has recently sent me an email saying, we will no longer allow freelancers from Russia or Belarus to use our platform.
Yep.
Now, we've heard stories nonstop that there are citizens who don't want this war.
Right.
We know several who are Russians who don't want this war. They don't agree with Putin, and they're being told they can't work.
Right. So from the point of view of that company, that platform, online internet platform, I assume their purpose is to punish Russia.
Correct.
They're saying, Russia, you did something wrong. This unjust war of aggression, which is true. It is an unjust war of aggression. So this platform decides to take down. Nobody in Russia and Belarus can actually do contract work. That's not hurting Putin.
Nope.
Who it's hurting are the guys just like our designer, right? The small business people, the contractors, the one who say, I have some talent and I want to create wealth by producing valuable things for other people. And all of a sudden they're shut off from the rest of the world.
So based on your Facebook argument, which I agree with and I love, I would argue that this platform is acting uncivilized.
Yeah.
Because they're not respecting the private property. Your ability to produce something of value for somebody else is your private property. And you blocking Vladimir Putin isn't on this platform.
Right.
The Russian oligarchs aren't on this platform trying to do freelance work.
We can't hire Putin to design a label for us, Dave?
I don't know that he's got design skills. They're not on this platform.
Right.
But this platform is deciding that these people have property in their ability, in their skill set, in their mind.
Yep.
They are not being allowed to leverage that work.
Yep.
To continue to provide for their family.
Let's keep pulling on that a little bit. So sanctions in general, that what you're describing is a form of a particular sanction. Sanctions in general that stop people within a regime, within a country from trading, from doing banking, from working in general. The premise is if we make the people suffer enough, eventually the people are going to get tired of suffering and they're going to fix the problems in their government.
Right.
I mean, that's the general premise, right? They're going to put pressure on the government to clean up its act and to stop doing bad things. The challenge is that's really difficult. That is no small thing, especially in a tyrannical regime of central planning and control like Russia. You're going up against the Russian government.
Yeah.
And the Russian government doesn't tolerate much dissent. It doesn't tolerate much opposition. It doesn't even tolerate really questioning of what it's doing. And so that can become a life or death proposition. And it really does go back to the point we made at the opening of this conversation. People might not think that their government represents them, that their own government is part of them, but it is to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
The rest of the world is going to associate you wherever you are, whether you're in the United States or you're in Russia or you're in Ukraine or you're anywhere else. The rest of the world, in certain key decisive moments, they're going to associate you with your government. And if they want to punish your government, you know who they're really going to punish? They're going to punish you. This is a powerful reason for people to never let their government get too powerful,
Right.
to get beyond their control. Because when your government is beyond your control, you don't know what kind of stupid things your government is going to do. You don't know what kind of unjust or cruel things your government is going to do. And then you're going to end up suffering as a result of it.
And at some point, you're going to get past the point of no return as far as being able to use non-violent methods to rein your government back in. And it is so easy for people to say, it's not my government. I don't relate to that government. We've heard for years, right? For 4 years of Trump and now for a year and a half of Biden, not my president. Right. Doesn't work that way. Right. If that government gets too strong, if that government gets too powerful,
that's right.
At some point you can't rein them back in. And we have got to look at what's happening in Ukraine and Russia right now. We have to look at what the situation is in China, what they're looking at with Taiwan, what the situation is in some of these other countries and throughout history. And we need to heed a warning right now, because if we don't heed that warning right now, we are going to cross that line. And to me, it's not too far off in the future.
Well, we have examples, right? Throughout history, we have examples. The Japanese in World War II, the Japanese didn't make a distinction between the United States government and citizens. When you're dropping bombs, right, it's hard to discriminate between these things. You just blow up everything that you can blow up. Osama bin Laden, he didn't make a distinction between those in government and citizens. He attacked office buildings,
right,
with a bunch of employees of private companies, right? And so these things matter. And I gotta say,
and I love this country and I love the founding ideas of this country, but we're not immune from that either.
Right.
And you listed some other countries, but go back to World War II. We dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
We murdered millions and millions of people. They didn't represent the Japanese government. They didn't have control over the Japanese government.
Right.
That's what happens to people when the government is all powerful over them.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are some important lessons here that we should wrap up with. And these lessons will be familiar to our members. These lessons should be more familiar to all Americans, really to all people around the world. These are lessons. These are not uniquely American lessons. These are just the lessons of prudence. These are the lessons of wisdom. This is what wise people do. Don't ever let your government get so big and so powerful and so controlling that you, the people, can't control your government. Because then all of a sudden you're in a position where your government can go do bad things, nasty, ugly, terrible things, and you're going to be held responsible, directly or indirectly. Even though you can't really control it, the rest of the world is going to look at you and say, you're part of that regime. You don't want to find yourself in that situation. At the same time, the solution to that, the solution can be really difficult.
Yeah.
It can be difficult if you cannot peacefully rein in your government and rein in that power. Then you might start reaching for more radical measures. You might start talking about revolution and these things. And against a really powerful, despotic, tyrannical government, that can be a terrifying prospect. Revolutions are always terrifying prospects. Nobody wants to launch a revolution because that means standing up and taking weapons and fighting against your own government. And they might have a lot more guns than you do. And right? It also demonstrates the importance of things like members of the military serving in the Army, in the Navy. What happens when the revolutionary spirit against a government starts to creep into a military? What would happen in Russia today if Russian soldiers, there are stories of Russian soldiers, they're deserting because they don't they don't believe in this fight. They don't believe in the Russian fight, but they're also not ready to launch a revolutionary movement against the Russian government. So what do? They just desert and try to run away and escape and disappear. But as that rebellious spirit spreads throughout an army, a military, that really starts to weaken the government as a whole.
Well, and then you get to that last point of, if you get a despotic government, if you get a person in charge of a government who has that hunger for power and he becomes desperate to not lose it, That's when desperate people do desperate things.
Yeah.
And that's when we end up with really horrific, really scary results. Everybody should be very worried about what happens at this point. If Vladimir Putin does start to feel like he's done, there are rumors right now that some of the oligarchs are ready to overthrow Putin. They're ready to have him assassinated, because of some of the sanctions and some of the things happening. He's got nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
What is going to stop him?
Yep.
Other than maybe a military personnel who are willing to stand up to him.
Yep.
What's going to stop him from launching a nuclear weapon? Because he knows he's going to be dead in a day anyway.
And here I want to close up on our sort of a big political point, political in the broadest sense of the term, the sense of self-government, the politics of self-government. Should the United States get caught up in this, and I pray that we don't. I don't want the United States entering a war in Europe. I don't want to see a World War III.
Agreed.
I don't know of anybody who does, except for a few. I've been watching. There's this trend of I do see progressives of various progressive Democrats, progressive Republicans, who were you used to say, "Oh, military spending is stupid. We need more social programs and stop spending money on military." And all of a sudden, they seem to be welcoming war in Europe. And I've been trying to remind those folks, you can't fight a war with welfare checks.
Yeah.
You fight a war with tanks and planes and bombs and guns and all those terrible things. This is a good time to remind our fellow citizens that war is an eminently political choice.
Yeah.
And whether or not we ever enter a war, whether it's this war or any other war, that decision ultimately, that is not a decision for unelected bureaucratic experts to make.
Nope.
What experts can do is remind us of what capabilities do we have? What capabilities does an enemy have? They should be studying those things. But the decision of, are we going to put our nation at war or not? That is a decision ultimately the American people should make. And so we need to be thinking as self-governing citizens and paying very close attention to what's going on and deciding what are we willing to commit our government to and what are we not going to commit our government to. And if those in government disagree with us, what are we going to do about that?
Right. Well, and that's why we should be electing virtuous citizens to public office. Those areas we can control, the ones we do elect, because we put people there to represent us. Our first and foremost goal should be, they should be virtuous and virtuous in the way we define it. They should have civic knowledge. They should be self-restrained. They should be self-assertive, and they should be self-reliant. And if we can trust them to be that, they should be making good decisions, and we should be able to trust them to make those decisions. And then it becomes a lot less worrisome when a decision like that comes to pass. At this point, I don't know how many virtuous citizens we have in those offices.
Right.
And in particular, I don't know how many of them have their own private interests. Hunter Biden at Burisma, Nancy Pelosi and some of her investment deals, some of the others. What are their incentives? And are they being virtuous citizens, or are they being self-incentive? Are they following their own self-incentives to improve themselves?
Back to the question, what choices do people make and why? We want to know that as a businessman in various markets. We also want to know the answer to those questions as citizens when watching members of our own government make decisions and make choices.
I think at the core, that's what it means to be a guardian of the American idea and a guardian of this country.
That's why we're going to keep doing what we do. Till next time, Dave, no sumos custodes.